Welcome to the 2023 Annual Sherman Community Lecture, co-hosted by the Jewish Representative Council of Greater Manchester and the Centre for Jewish Studies at my own institution, the University of Manchester. My name is Nalin Thakkar, as you've heard. I'm Vice President for, amongst other things, social responsibility at the university. I'll explain that a bit because people often wonder what it means when the university talks about social responsibility. We are unique amongst universities in having social responsibility as an equal core goal with research and teaching. This means that we believe that our mission is to benefit society, to have a positive impact through our teaching, through our research, through our public and community engagement, and through how we run our operations, how we function. Climate crisis and the threat to environmental sustainability are perhaps the biggest existential challenges we face globally today. Therefore, it's no surprise that my brief includes the university's response to this challenge and how the university becomes a zero-carbon university with environmentally sustainable practices. My brief also includes community engagement, and I'm delighted to have had the privilege and pleasure of knowing and working with many members of the JRC and the UK's second biggest Jewish community here in Greater Manchester. This engagement is important for all of us at all times, of course, but its value and significance have been particularly highlighted by the recent events and the increasing incidents and threats of anti-Semitism and hate crime in Manchester and elsewhere. Given my background and role, I'm particularly delighted to have been asked to introduce our speaker for 2023 Annual Sherman Community Lecture tonight, Professor Hava Tirosh-Samuelson, who is joining us this evening from Arizona. Professor Tirosh-Samuelson is the Regents Professor of History, the Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism, and the Director of Jewish Studies at the Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona, where I heard just now that the temperature is nice 22 degrees, not 4 degrees as in Manchester at the moment. An intellectual historian, she writes on Jewish philosophy and mysticism, religion, science and technology, and religion and ecology. In addition to over 70 journal articles and book chapters, Professor Tirosh-Samuelson is the author of a number of books, which I will only mention two that particularly caught my eye, namely Happiness in Pre-Modern Judaism, Virtue, Knowledge and Well-Being, published in 2003, and Religion and the Environment, The Case of Judaism, published in 2020. Amongst the many volumes of which she's an editor is Judaism and Ecology, Created World and Revealed Word, published in 2002, Judaism and the Phenomenon of Life, Legacy of Hans Jonas, published in 2008, Perfecting Human Futures, Transhuman Visions and Technological Imaginations, published in 2016. She's also the editor-in-chief of the Library of Contemporary Jewish Philosophers, a monumental work of 21 volumes. I could go on much longer and take up the whole hour talking about Professor Tirosh-Samuelson's achievements, but clearly she's eminently well qualified to give tonight's lecture, which is entitled Judaism and Climate Change, Religious Response to Eco-Crisis. Professor Tirosh-Samuelson, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. Although here it's only noontime, or just an hour after noon, but it's an honor and pleasure to be with all of you, and thanks for the people who put it together. It would have been wonderful to be with you, but from an environmental perspective, the virtual lecture is actually better. So what I would like to to do in order to start is actually this way. So I decided I'm going to tell you a little bit just to situate myself. You'll know who you're talking to by telling you that I'm a product. I was born in Israel, in Kibbutz Afikim. I'm a product of the Zionist movement. Both my parents were really nature lovers. The two pictures you see on the right are what Kibbutz Afikim, the fields in Kibbutz Afikim looked like in the 1930s. And my mother was the person who was in charge of all the vegetable fields in Kibbutz Afikim, which was actually a very large place with over 1,200 people in the kibbutz. So this was a serious operation. The reason I mention it is to keep in mind that for the Zionists, like my mother and other people in the kibbutz, going back to the land of Israel in the beginning of the 20th century was kind of a return to nature. And she was very much influenced by A.D. Gordon, Aaron David Gordon, to whom we ascribe the phrase of religion and labor, even though he himself didn't coin it. But the point was that the way to be Jewish or Jewishness was expressed through physical labor. And what the way I understand her mentality, she's long dead. She's no longer with us. She died in 1997. The point of her commitment to the fields was very, very similar to the way traditional Jews actually think about the meaning of being Jewish. So she was committed to avodat adama, to working the fields. But it takes dedication, tenacity, faithfulness, all of those virtues that traditional Jews take for granted when they are committed to religious life. I went to the Hebrew University. I'm a product of the Hebrew University. I studied Jewish philosophy and Kabbalah. And there too was my approach to Judaism and to the study of Judaism was shaped. Basically, it was intellectual history, or you can call it a little bit more history of ideas in the Hebrew University. When I taught at Columbia, I became more an intellectual historian rather than just historian of ideas. But the point is that for the first 25 years in the United States, I came to the United States in 1977 when I married an American Jew. And in the beginning, I focused just on medieval philosophy and Kabbalah, but in the last 25 years, or at least 20 years for sure, I've been focusing on science and religion, religion and ecology, ethics, gender studies. 1997, I participated in this conference on world religion and the environment. It was organized by Mary Evelyn Thakkar and John Graham. I'll tell you more that. But these are the people who created the field of religious studies. So these are the two books that were already mentioned. This is the more recent one, Religion and Environment, came out of a series of lectures on science and religion that I delivered in 2016. It finally came out in 2020. This is the book that was edited in 2002. And what we have here is the kind of the first anthology, no, it wasn't the first, it was the second, actually, second anthology that puts together a lot of the work in the early beginning of Judaism and ecology. This is a kind of a brief summary of the books, the essays. I have a big annotated bibliography from 2015, which I'm now supposed to update, and the book chapters, journal essays. So this is how to understand that what my approach is. And my approach is basically one of an intellectual historian. So I'm interested in how conceptions of nature emerged and evolved over time. I'm always considering how philosophers, theologians, and mystics conceptualized nature and interpreted the canonic text of Judaism, how Jewish thinkers over the century resolved various problems and emerged in the encounters between philosophical and scientific approaches to nature, and finally, how nature has functioned in framing Jewish historical experience, especially in the modern world. So what's the bottom line here is this. If you ask, I'll pose 4 short questions. If you ask me, okay, so what does Judaism have to do with climate change? That's usually how people pose the question to me. So is Judaism relevant to climate change? The short answer is very much so. Second question, what have Jews done about climate change since becoming aware of it? The short answer is a lot. Third question, can Judaism help Jews live in a manner that is appropriate to a world impacted by climate change? Again, the short answer is yes. And can Jews do more? The short answer is absolutely. So the structure of my talk, this is kind of my take-home message. I'll start with that, actually. That nature is very central to Jewish religious self-understanding. There's just no way to interpret the Jewish tradition without paying attention to nature, even though the reference to nature is not necessarily to the word teva in Hebrew, but rather to the word bria, which means creation. But that's what we mean when we think about the natural world. In terms, a second point that I would like you to keep in mind is a summary in a sense, and I'll have other occasions to summarize. Judaism harbors deep ecological wisdom that addresses our eco-crisis. And finally, that contemporary Jewry has responded to climate change through scholarship and activism. So I will go on both of those trajectory, both the scholarship and the activism. In terms of the structure, I'm going to start comments, since you all know about climate change. I don't need to teach the basics, but just that we'll have some visual images. I think we need it. So we'll talk about climate change and as the face of the eco-crisis. And that's my main point, that it's a mistake to separate climate change from the eco-crisis, which is what's going on today. Rather, as I will present to you, the climate change really became the face of it only from the really 1998 and later. But before that, there's a much larger and more integrative approach. Second part is the denominational responses to climate change. I'm going to focus primarily on America, of course, because that's what I know best. I'm not really up on what's going on either in England or in Australia, where there is a lot of environmental interests. Part 3 would be shared principles of climate activism. And finally, the conclusion, I will end by saying that Judaism actually gives us a way to think about the future in hopeful terms. And my inspiration, of course, is Rabbi Sachs. So let's move on to, part 1. Climate change, a few things that we need to know about climate change. So here are the manifestations, some visual images of the manifestations with which we're all familiar. We are talking about devastating storms, very devastating, destructive floodings, persistent droughts, as we see here, for example, melting of polar ice caps, retreats of glaciers, rising sea levels and coastal erosion, thawing of permafrost, change of seasonal cycles, and the list goes on and on. You are all familiar with it. The thing to keep in mind is that all of those phenomena will have major social impact, already have major social impact. I'll just keep one idea in mind. By 2050, the number of climate refugees is expected to be 1 billion people. That's quite amazing. By 2070, 19% of the planet's land surface will be uninhabitably hot. Well, I'm already in Arizona, and we had a very, very difficult summer this year, the hottest year. The impact of climate change is not evenly distributed, of course. Poorest countries suffer more, and even though they produce fewest greenhouse gases. The uneven social burden clearly makes climate change a matter of social justice. Who is responsible for addressing the social cost of climate change? Who should pay for the cost of the higher temperatures that higher temperatures bring about? And how can we address the social impact of climate change? So I'll speak more about the social climate change and the social justice issue in part 2 and part 3. But before I do that, that's probably a statement you're all familiar with. It came out in 2022. That's the IPCC report. Came out in February 28, 2022. And here the clear awareness to those of us who are not scientists, but clear summary of it. Scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Basically, we have no time. We are running out of time after spending many years, unfortunately, by either devoting our time to wishful thinking or to ideological discussion or to consumerism or to lobbying. Basically, we wasted, unfortunately, a lot of time because, as we shall see, most of the issues were already known by 1960s. And we are now in the early 20s of the 21st century, and we still haven't done the work. I would like to introduce you to this person whom some of you may know. He's at Cambridge. He's a climatologist. And Mike Hume is an important person for us to consider, especially, well, this is the earlier book that made him very famous. And here the point is to explain the importance of culture in the discussion about climate change. But I want to start with this book, which is the more recent book, Climate Change is Not Everything, and introduce you to his distinction between climate change and climatism. So climate change is the impact. Oh, I'll put it this way. Climate change refers to the reality of climatic changes that impact humans and non-humans. But climatism is an ideology that reduces all changes to one factor, and that's climate, offering meta-narrative that explains every aspect of life by appealing to climate change. So basically, he is for interpreting climate change in light of cultural and social and political contexts, but not making climatism into the ideology that explains everything. The very fact that he focused on culture means that he takes seriously the role of religion. Now, the story of religion and how it became relevant to the climate change, that goes back all the way to 1967. Actually, it started December 1966, when this famous medieval historian of technology, Lin White Jr., basically made the explosive argument that the problem of climate change should be put at the doorstep of what he calls the Judeo-Christian traditions. So in other words, the Abrahamic tradition, he didn't use that term, but Judaism and the Judeo-Christian tradition are to be blamed because of the book of Genesis that presumably gives humanity the license to exploit the natural world. And what he suggested in that very short essay, which appeared in early 1967, that we need to go back to the religious tradition and find within it, and for him in Christianity, find in it the resources to come up with religious responses to the ecological crisis. We need to basically do this. We need to recover, revival, reinterpret, reconstruct the ecological wisdom of our religious tradition. For him, primarily in Christianity, that meant to go to the Franciscan tradition within Christianity, and St. Francis would become indeed the kind of patron saint, so to speak, of environmentalists today. I introduce you here to the two people who created the field of religion and ecology. This is Mayor Evelyn Thakkar and her husband, John Green. They are the authors of this book from 2014. But more importantly, they are the people who put together the series of conferences at Harvard. This is my book here, The Judaic Tradition, but that's that volume, kind of that set of 10 volumes really begins the academic field of religion and ecology. And what they have suggested to us, I'll go back here. What's interesting in this field, that this field combines theory and practice. So it's not just about scholarship, it's also how you translate scholarship into action. And what happened after the emergence of the field of religion and ecology, of religion and nature, after that produced all those things, the edited volumes, the monographs, the essays, the conferences, all this work, what we have is also the emergence of religious environmentalism. That means social activism by faith-based groups that are very concerned about better kind of improving, or dealing with religious with environmental problems on the ground, but doing it not just as academics do it, but with a desire to solve specific problems. So we have both activism and academic scholarship at the same time. What did Jews do to respond to the claim that the Bible is the problem, that the Judeo-Christian tradition is problematic? The initial response was actually, I have to admit, quite apologetic. And basically, Judaica scholars said that Lynn White didn't do the Bible any justice because he only focused on Genesis 1. He didn't look at Genesis 2, especially the famous line, the important line in Genesis 2:15, to till and protect, or to till and tend the earth. And he also didn't do anything with post-biblical Judaic texts. And he generalized, the very fact that he generalized about the Judeo-Christian was problematic, because you really need to understand the differences between Judaism and Christianity when it comes to the natural world. So I would like to suggest to you this person who needs no introduction. Everybody here knows who Rabbi Sachs is, but I bring up Rabbi Sachs because Rabbi Sachs tells us how crucial it is to look at environmental issues from a religious perspective. And this is a rather long quote, so I may not read the whole of it, but basically when he's telling us global warming is not the result of one person using leaded petrol or an aerosol spray, but of billions of acts distributed throughout the world. The main point that he is bringing to our attention is, what then is my responsibility, right? What is my responsibility? What duties do I have to something as amorphous as humanity in general, as inanimate as nature, or as intangible as generations not yet born? And to him, the answer to those questions, of course, goes back to religious responsibility. So we will hear more about responsibility, but clearly that's the connection between the religious approach to environmentalism and the challenges ahead of us. I'm not going to, maybe I will read one more statement by Rabbi Sachs, in which he explained why the Bible is so different from the environment in which it emerged. And it's important to us to keep in mind, because he focuses on the concept on the religious understanding of creation. So what he's saying is as follows. This comes from his book on the Great Partnership, but I don't have a slide here for it. So he's saying to us the following: the Bible transformed the human condition, endowing it with meaning and thereby rescuing from tragedy in the name of hope. If God created the physical universe, then God is free. And if God made us in his image, we are free. If we are free, then history is not a matter of eternal recurrence, because we can change ourselves, we can change the world. That is the religious basis of hope. And I want you to keep that line in mind, because when I will end that lecture talking about hope, and I think that it really is so well put, like everything else he did for us, by Rabbi Sachs. So I would like to suggest to you a few books that you may want to take a look at. This book that puts together all the writings in religious and on Judaism and ecology up to 201. This is a book by Ellen Bernstein, which is systematic biblical theology that deals with the concept of creation. Jeremy Benstein is a very important environmentalist, and this book tells you kind of how to be Jewish and to be environmentally engaged. That's from 206. This book by David Seidenberg, whom I will mention a little bit later, is Kabbalah and Ecology. It's basically the most sophisticated eco-theology, Jewish eco-theology that you may, it's Kabbalistically based and Hasidically oriented, but it's very well put together in terms of the resources that are relevant to how to think about Judaism and the ecology. This is a more recent book by Professor at University of Toronto, who I will mention again later, and that focuses on the precept of Bal Tashchit, to not destroy, and explains the kind of the discourse, the whole jurisprudential discourse on that particular precept. And this is the most recent book, which came out, The Sacred Earth, Jewish Perspective on basically on our very topic here. I would highly recommend that you take a look at that. A lot of the people, some of the people I mentioned are in that anthology. So it's not just what people have produced in writing. We also have environmental organizations that emerged when Judaism began to address the environmental concerns. These are the three most important ones, one from 93, one from 2000, and this one, Adama, is the most important one. I'm gonna share this with you just that you'll see a little bit of the trajectory. And my point here, by putting those dates in front of you, is to make the story a little bit more complex. So if you think it's not just these organizations actually tell a certain story of how strong are Jewish environmental organizations today. This is from 1993, which was a combination of 29 organizations. This was 2000, and for a long time was the dominant in 2000 and 2010. But by 2021, this organization combined with another environmental organization. So if you look at the story may not be a story of strength. It may be a story of the need to consolidate, and it's not necessarily that everything is flourishing. So we may get to it in the discussion. So that kind of gives you a sense of the academic field and the connection between what people write about and what people actually do as Jewish people who care about environmentalism. I will speak about environmental activism as I get to part 2 and 3. So part 2. Basically, this part I would like to share with you how the various denominations in the United States approached climate change. I will highlight plurality and diversity, change over time, shared religious idiom, and the down-to-earth Judaism. The expression down-to-earth Judaism comes from Arthur Waskow, associated with the Jewish Renewal Movement. We'll see more about him. In other words, I'm not sure, this comes actually from Adama, from one of their brochures, but I'm not sure that there is a Jewish response to climate change. Maybe they should have done better by saying Jewish responses, as I try to show in the title of my lectures. Before I get into the denominational responses, I want to bring the issue is who is a Jewish environmentalist? And it's not a simple issue. This is an example, this is a kind of a cluster of 4 wonderfully important people, but very few people are familiar with them, unfortunately. This was a wonderful person, Robert Marshall, the son of Louis Marshall, who is the founder of the Wilderness Society in 1934. He died very young because of cancer and other diseases, but already in the 30s and even before, you have Jews engaged in that. And if you understand his history, I can give you a lecture on each of these people. You'll find that it's very interesting what made him. He was a Reform Jew, but didn't really associate after a certain point in his life, didn't associate with Reform Judaism anymore. I will go next to this fascinating person, that's Mori Bookchin. Mori Bookchin is associated with social ecology. He is the theorist of social ecology, was a Marxist Jew, Marxist Trotskyist and anarchist, all of the fascinating character. You can't understand social ecology without Mori Bookchin. This is Barry Commoner, who gave us the 4 laws of ecology, and very important in educating the public. This is Paul Ehrlich from a Reform background. Those 2 are from Marxist background, communist even background, and he's from Reform background, and a scientist, a person who talked first about the overpopulation. Each one of them deserves a lecture, or all of them deserve a lecture. That's my point. My point here, this conversation is not religious. The religious conversation really begins with Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism took the lead, but it did it relatively early, 1965. That's before Lynn White gave his famous talk. And already in 1965, we are dealing with religious responses when the Union of Reform Judaism noted, and I'm quoting now, that America, in thoughtlessly abusing its natural resources, has disregarded the biblical injunction to conserve God's creation for the good of all. So what you have here, the statement that you have here from the same document is that it's a crime against life. Can you imagine? Already in 65, we're talking in those terms, and it's a tragedy that all of us will have to deal with unless we do the right thing. So clearly, Reform Judaism, both the organization of the various congregations as well as the Reform leadership, understood the problem very early on. Here's a kind of a summary, and obviously I'm not expecting all of it, for anybody to remember all this, but all I'm saying that you can see change over time. How in the beginning it's all about conservation of resources, and then it's about pollution, and then it shifts to energy issues, and then to industrial toxins, and that the issue of environmental racism and environmental justice emerge. Okay, so those two issues come at the end of the 80s and through the early 90s. Climate change begins to get on the map only in the late 90s, and that's because of the failure of Kyoto. So the Kyoto conference, basically United States moved away from it, and that's where finally everybody realized that something is we're not doing enough. That's where it starts. 2009, we have climate change as a social justice issue, should be issue, not in plural. And then climate change becomes the number one topic, or the face of the issue, the face of the eco crisis since 2015 and on. So that gives you a little bit of kind of the trajectory, and more or less you can fit everybody on this kind of timeline. When you ask yourself the question, okay, so what shall we do? How shall we respond? The CCR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, of course, that's the Reform movement. I would like to suggest to you again the awareness that people very early on within the Reform movement understood that what they need to do is change energy policy. They talk more about conservation of energy, and they look at it as a personal responsibility of every American, of course, every American Jew as well. And all of that will take a lot of sacrifices. They are going to talk about various mitigation practices that are needed. But I would like to bring you to this quote when it's understood, definitely by 2017, but even before, that climate change is fundamentally a social justice issue. And we can, in the discussion, when we can discuss whether this is good when the focus is on social justice as opposed to just on conservation and preservation, which happened before. But now that's where the conversation is going. But we have a mandate to be good stewards of the earth with our call to care for the least among us. So that's the position of the Reform movement, but it's also shared by all the other movements. So I want to shift to another important movement in America, and that's the Jewish Renewal movement, because they are the people who produced a lot of the thinkers, the theologians, and some of the activists. So the person here is probably familiar to all of you. That's Zalman Schachter Shalomi. Next to him is Arthur Waskow. This is Rabbi Arthur Green. These are the kind of the leader, the visionaries of Jewish eco-theology. We would not have Jewish environmentalism without these three. The people, the younger people here are, in a sense, they're disciples, if you wish. This is David Seidenberg, whose book on Kabbalah and ecology was mentioned before. This is Ariel Mays, who is a professor at Stanford University and a disciple of Art Green. And this is Zeli Golden, who is a major activist and the founder of Wilderness Torah. So again, the movement, the Jewish Renewal movement, has been very important of putting environmentalism as the focal point of at least the progressive and the left-wing, the more lefty-oriented strands within American Judaism. An important point here is that already in the 70s, Zalman Schachter Shalomi and Art Green, not Art Green, sorry, Arthur Waskow, both of them came up with the concept of eco-kashrut or eco-kosher as social justice and eco-justice. So this is happening in the 70s, even before social justice movement and environmental racism kind of takes off. All those issues are articulated in the 70s. And what's the point here? The point here is that we cannot think about the well-being and the fecundity of the land without thinking about moral conduct. So that's the insight of the book of Deuteronomy, according to them, and that's the insight of Judaism that we need to follow. If you are corrupt, if corruption increases in the land, then the result would be exile. And if you want to deal with that, you have to care for the earth and you have to care for the socially marginal. So they basically, based on Deuteronomic ethics, they put together this concept of eco-justice or social justice as eco-justice as something that leads to this. It means that your food, if you follow the logic of eco-justice, the food cannot be kosher if it's not produced in a moral way. If you use child labor, for example, in food production, then it cannot be kosher, even though halachically it could be kosher. So that idea already came in the early 70s, and it will take off during the 80s and on. But in terms of eco-theology, what the Jewish renewal movement has done is to really become the focus is to create a Jewish ecological spirituality. I give you some of the themes, some of the elements here. It's all related to Hasidism, to Kabbalah, so you have to know that language in order to see how it all works. But whether it's pantheistic or panentheistic, there is a debate. Art Green claims he's panentheistic. Zalman Schachter Shalom always said that there is no real difference between those two. But of course, theologically, we can talk whether there is or isn't a difference. But they are articulating a worldview that emphasizes divine immanence rather than divine transcendence. The focus is on interconnectedness of all created beings. And I have to say that this orientation is very open to Jewish feminism and ecofeminism. I will end with some references to that at the end of the talk. But Jewish ecological spirituality owes greatly to the people I just shared with you on a previous screen. So these are the people, especially these three. So now we move to another variant of American Judaism, and that's today it's called Reconstructing Judaism. It used to be called Reconstructionist Judaism, obviously the followers of Mordechai Kaplan. And what you see is during the 80s, they come up with resolutions on all of these topics: pollution, greenhouse effects, acid rains. You can go through, read all their resolutions, and you'll see how incredibly committed they are to addressing environmental issues. One of the people leading all this is Rabbi Fred Sherlinder-Dodd, and he is very connected to COGIL. Actually, he was the chair of COGIL, the Coalition of Environment and Jewish Life. And here, the focus is not so much Neo-Hasidism, but Buberian dialogical philosophy as the inspiration for the focus on relationality and interconnectedness. So real relationship to God cannot be achieved on earth if real relations to the world and to mankind are lacking. Both love of the Creator and love of that which God has created are finally one and the same. So is this pantheism? Is this panentheism? We can talk about that. But clearly, he was a very influential mover and shaker, so to speak, within the Reconstructionist movement. The language of Tikkun Olam, a phrase that is probably known to all of you, right? The repair of the world. So Reconstructionist movement came up with the Tikkun Olam initiative. Many congregations were involved in it. So clearly, Reconstructionist Judaism, as well as Reform Judaism, as well as the Jewish Renewal movement, was very kind of translated Tikkun Olam as a concept to environmental activism. When you go to the conservative movement was no less, or perhaps on some level even more, also involved lots of, I cannot put on one screen all the references to their various resolutions, but you can see that the topics are very similar. First, you start with kind of what to do on pollution, what to do about hazardous waste, things like that. And then you kind of move beyond it and move into energy issues, and that's what's going to happen later. But I want to bring this to your mind. 201 is when they use this document, this statement from 201, uses the concept of stewardship which is very common in religious conversation about environmentalism. So humanity must serve as faithful stewards to creation. We are morally compelled to choose safe, clean, and sustainable sources of energy. So clearly the issue of energy is itself, energy policy, energy issues, what to do about energy, that is framed in a religious way as part of being a good steward. And clearly by 201, it's very clear to them that we are responsible for global warming and for pollution and so forth, and we need to do something about it. The conservative movement, through their various bodies, came up with many resolutions, and the focus is on mitigation. What do you need to do, and what do you need to do on the local level or within the community, within the congregation, but also within energy policy, national energy policy, that you can contribute to. So they are very involved in that direction. One person from the conservative movement who was very influential, unfortunately, is no longer with us, Lawrence Troster, Rabbi Lawrence Troster. And the reason I bring him up here is not only because of his work, which was so precious in everything he has done, but also because he showed how Jews need to be involved in interfaith activism, environmental activism. He was a member and was very importantly involved with Green Faith. And that's a position that I also take, that Jews and Judaism need to be much more prominent within interfaith work that deals with the environmental challenges ahead. So these are some of the body, the Interfaith Power and Light, Interfaith Green Network, and this image tells you that it's not just the Abrahamic traditions, but also the Eastern traditions. The point here is Rabbinical Assembly recognizes a Jewish responsibility to address global climate change. So clearly by the end of the previous decade, it was almost, I would say, taken for granted that that's the way to go. Okay, what else do you do? Creating this green covenant is more specific about specific things you can do within the synagogue, within the community, on a local level, regional level, in order to basically reduce carbon emission by 50%. This is nice. It's easier said than done, of course, and it's always a lot easier to go on a march rather than really achieve those goals. But at least the awareness exists by that time. So this Green Covenant is a project of the conservative movement. They also go and give you a whole detailed kind of activities, what you need to do, how to reduce waste, how to deal with non-toxic cleaning. Basically, my point here that this is down to earth in action. That's what it looks like, that religious leaders and religious communities are dealing with climate change on this level, even the level of carpools and public transportations. Here are some of the organizations that are engaged. From 2000 on, the concept of sustainability is a Jewish value. Basically, if you're going to be environmentally a Jew and environmentally engaged, you have to promote sustainability. So you see it in all sorts of ways. That's the Chazon seal of sustainability. Again, if you ask me, so who knows about it? It's an issue. It's not totally clear to me that Jews in America are really familiar with all those activities, but those who are involved, this is what they are doing. Now let's go quickly to modern Orthodoxy. Of course, modern Orthodoxy is always involved, even though they came a little bit late to the conversation. So the conversation really begins from 1988, whereas Reform Judaism was already doing it in 1965. And they got on board also creating a particular Torah-based environmentalism. This is the Kanfei Nesharim. Later, it will combine with another organization called Grow Torah. But this is from 2003. So it's a way to teach children in Orthodox schools and day schools how to be environmentally concerned and involved. So it's a very important initiative. And actually, I argue that there's a lot of shared conversation going on. We need to develop that. This is one of the activists that really put environmentalism on the map. He's an Orthodox math professor. It doesn't look like that today, is much older today, but he started in the early 80s This is his first book from the, not his first, that's the second, I think, from Judaism and Global Survival. But here you see the focus on veganism, not just vegetarianism, but also veganism as the solution, as the approach, both to climate change and to what Judaism needs to be in the 21st century. Another person who is a big, very important activist, more than activist, I look at him as a spiritual entrepreneur, charismatic leader. He's here in Phoenix and we are good friends. And these are some of his organizations. He's a student of Itz Greenberg, Rabbi Itz Greenberg. And what you see here is how focus on suffering is extended. So you have to take care of all forms of oppression, all forms of injustice, all forms of suffering, whether people, animal, or the environment. So here's the person I mentioned earlier, Tanchum Yoreh, a professor who has trained in the social sciences. And his point is what Jewish environmentalism needs to do is to speak in a language that Jews, Orthodox Jews, can really be sensitive to. So a lot has to do with how do you present the material, how do you package it in a way that Orthodox Jews can engage in environmental activism. But clearly, he's done a lot of work on what is done in Orthodox community, both in Israel, in the United States, and in Canada. And it's not the case that modern Orthodox cannot be environmentally concerned. It's absolutely not the case. On the contrary, you can use halachic thinking and the jurisprudential tradition in order to reach sustainable practices. So I'll skip that very clearly, but before COP26, Orthodox rabbis in Israel, and I didn't speak at all about Israel, it's a whole conversation, another lecture, but basically here's a recognition that the modern Orthodox world is very aware that reducing the impact of climate change or reducing climate change should be a central focus of Jewish life today. So what's my point? My point that to the left, to the middle, and to the right, all of the strands of modern Judaism in America are very much aware of climate change. I'll go quickly on the major points here. What does activism looks like? And the assumption is, those are the two assumptions which I think doesn't really, this comes from conservative state, conservative document, conservative Judaism document, but those are the assumptions that all people who are engaged in this work share. Because all human beings are created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God, and since we're all equally God's children, we should all equitably share in the bounty and travails of the earth. So that's all going. So there's no way to think about responsibility without bringing up the notion of creation in a divine image. Here, another variant, we have a religious responsibility. Let's go back to what Sachs told us, Rabbi Sachs told us. So we have a responsibility to future generations. That idea philosophically was defended by Hans Jonas, a very important philosopher. I've written a lot about him. And clearly, we have to think in terms of the ecological limits of the earth and what needs to happen in order not to exceed those limits. So I would say that all Jewish environmentalists share those two assumptions. Climate advocacy becomes the name of the game if you're an environmentalist, as I told you, not before 1990s, and especially since 2015, really. So all of them have, I think, shared assumption. First of all, they look at it as a moral issue. It's not just a scientific issue. It's not going to be solved by technoscience. Second, it's all going to be dealt with by focusing on justice. Special attention has to be given to this, to refugees, how to deal with that. But what you need to do is to look at your financial practices and decide what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And especially you have to regulate what corporations, especially the transnational corporations, are doing. All of those ideas actually come from Arthur Waskow. Without him, probably we will not have all this conversation. This is Jenny Rosen, a very important activist, climate activist. She created the Dayenu, a call for action on climate. I'll show the logo in a second. But clearly from the 2015 and on, climate change is the focus. So this is Arthur Wasco that we've seen before. If you may not want to read everything he's written a lot more, but maybe the last book especially would be of interest to you because there's a big chunk there about climate issues. And he himself is the person who articulated what's wrong with climate, our response to climate from the economic perspective and socioeconomic perspective. When he denounced the various the transnational corporations that are dealing with mineral extractions and oil extraction as carbon pharaohs. So it's a very powerful phrase. And he's the one who really turned Tikkun Olam into a full-fledged environmental program. And he writes so much, both online and in print, and has a lot of people who follow him. So politically speaking, you can see that he's on the left, of course, by supporting the Green New Deal, but we're not doing too well on the Green New Deal right now. It's still not approved. So where are we now? Here are some of the recommendations of COJEL, the Coalition of Environment to Jewish Life, just to show you that from 2009, they came up with specific, they're not as active, the organization is not as active as it used to be, but they came up with the principles that can guard our energy policy. From 2015, you cannot talk about climate change after 2015 without mentioning Pope Francis I and Laudato Si. The Laudato Si movement had enormous impact on the way Jewish thinkers and activists frame the issues. And I really believe that the focus on creation care should be, basically, I think all the three Abrahamic traditions are committed to creation care. So it's not just a slogan that just evangelical movements in the United States can use and say, okay, we can talk about creation care rather than environmentalism. No, all religious environmentalism in America shares the concept of creation care. And how do we know that? When he came to the United States in September 2015, before that visit, there was a rabbinic letter in which basically the orientation was already the kind of the need to take care of climate change and to call for Tikkun Olam as part of the healing of the planet, and the healing of the planet means dealing with climate change. So this statement here, we call for a new sense of eco-social justice. We urge those who have been focusing on social justice to address the climate crisis, and those who have been focusing on climate crisis to address social justice. That's all from 2015. It's not everything, of course, it doesn't summarize the entire document, but this is the case. To me, that's the solution. We have to work in an interfaith manner and join the Laudato Si movement as Jews contributing a particular Jewish voice. So the rabbinic letter also tells you what to do in terms, again, within your own organization, or your own synagogue, your own, whatever it is, what you need to do with the banks, how to change various investment policies, how to deal with various endowments that are based on money from use of carbon. All of those issues, all of those practices tell you that it's very much down to earth Judaism that in order to deal with environmental. And I'm racing toward the end. If you ask me, what does it mean to be a climate advocate? This is what it means. So you engage in education, networking, you do a lot of protest, as we see, for example, here. This is mostly the face of climate change advocacy. That's the same person we've seen before. This is two organizations that were this was in 2016, this is in 2019. This is her organization, the Yenwa Jewish Call to Climate Action, and that's now Climate Leadership Coalition, which is all under Adama, which is now the leading environmental organization. Women play an important role. So the two women that created climate change organization to deal with climate change, Jenny Rosen and where did I put? Oh, I left her. No, here she is, Mira Goldsmith. These two women are climate activists, but there were many other women who are actually leaders. So here are their some of their faces that you'll see it's all real people, real environment. She's no longer with us. She passed away, but this is Roberta Kalichowski, who was the first to talk about animal rights in Judaism. That's Nina Cardin. She doesn't look like that today, but she's a very important conservative rabbi, very involved in climate activism. That's Yvonne Marzouk, the founder of Kanfei Nesharim. She's Orthodox. That's her. That's Jenny Rosen. That's Mirli Goldsmith. She's a nature activist and teacher, very involved in Jewish organizations. That's another person who's connected to the Jewish Renewal Movement, Jill Hammer, Rabbi Jill Hammer. That's the theologian Judith Plaskow, and that's Rabbi Lynn Gottlieb. So this is just a snapshot of some of the activists. There are many more, and that kind of leads me, if you ask me why, I'm going to skip a little bit. Why, as I look to the future, why am I somewhat optimistic about it? I'm optimistic because of the involvement of young people. I'm optimistic because of the recognition that we need to have what this banner says, an environmental tshuva. We need to recognize what we're doing wrong and how we need to correct it. So our challenge is to adapt to climate change, because we're not going to undo climate change, even with technology, but we have to adapt. Our task is to care globally, but act locally. Our hope is the youth climate activism, such as we see in this picture. If you ask me what do they teach us and what do they want us to do, it's to become more sustainable, to engage in sustainable practices within our institutions, to plant urban gardens, to organize nature walks. There are lots of ways in which we can develop this sensibility that I call environmentalism. And environment is primarily a sensibility, an orientation to life and to what we are doing. And a lot depends on education. So this is the summary of all the talk. Basically, all denominations, perhaps except ultra-Orthodoxy, were involved in responding to climate change. They all use the same sources, biblical and rabbinic. Some of them use Hasidic, Kabbalistic, and philosophic. Basically, they do it in their own distinctive way. They're all about adaptation and mitigation. And I would like to end with this last one. So addressing climate change is the task of the 21st century, but we shouldn't oversimplify it, and we should not turn it into climatism, but we should look at it as a holistic way to respond to the eco-crisis as a whole. And that's precisely the point that Mike Hume said in the beginning, or I brought to your attention in the beginning of the lecture.